So I'm Lucy Pye, and thanks again for coming out this morning. So the title of my paper, which is quite long and has a colon and the word design in it, comes from something I'd said to my co-author, Nardi, when I was reflecting on a project I had once worked on. So this project, let's call it Project X, could be loosely classified as interventionist HCI with social good aims. And, okay. So Project X had followed the right steps of starting with a needs assessment and then iterating through prototypes, incorporating user feedback from on-site user testing. And this is as opposed to a wrong approach of not interacting with users, failing to see their context, being ignorant of their needs, and galloping in on a white stallion of reckless tech saviorism. So we didn't do this, and plenty of research has shown this to be ineffective and inappropriate. But despite avoiding these mistakes, Project X was still unable to deliver any lasting benefit to the community it was intended to serve. And this is what the "it was still wrong" part of the title refers to. So a little bit about Project X. It involved the design and development of a game platform that could embed practice content created by teachers. And the reason I'm calling it Project X is not to flame a project that I worked on and I valued, but just to sort of use it as an example. And it was designed to help English language learners practice English outside of limited class time, which was a need that was actually found during the needs assessment. And the partner for the project was a community literacy center, which offered free English as a second language classes to adult, immigrant, and resettled refugee populations. So 2 years after my involvement with Project X ended, I returned to the literacy center, this time in an ethnographic engagement, conducting participant observations while embedded as an English and technology teacher at the center over a period of 16 months. And during this time, several interventions involving technology were taken up, with more success towards sustainable impact than Project X had experienced. These periods of fieldwork form the basis for the framework I'm presenting today, which is a framework for sustainable impact in resource-constrained settings, where human-centered, needs-based design can often still fall short. So before we get into the framework, I wanted to set up a few definitions. So sustainable impact here refers to the capacity of an intervention to continue to have positive impact after the research team is no longer involved. And I know positive impact can be defined from a variety of angles, and it can be contentious, but typically we can agree that a prototype that is never deployed or never adopted or just lays about broken and out of use is not delivering positive impact. And Project X is not alone as a project that, despite following these sort of right approaches to design, falls short of delivering sustainable impact. And it's often in resource-constrained contexts that many projects following the right design approaches still fall short. Now in HCI, resource-constrained typically is a code for words like developing or otherwise referring to communities that are constrained with issues of poverty, so that's examples such as where infrastructure like literacy or electricity are lacking, but we wanted to sort of extend this to refer to also contexts where other things such as environmental resources or attention or emotional or social resources are also constrained, because we think that this framework, although it comes from also a more typical definition of resource constraint, can extend into these other areas where HCI does interventions. So now I'm going to pop up the framework and we'll talk about it a little bit, but I want you to keep in mind that I've got a little activity at the end, so let this percolate in your mind. If you have anything you've read about or you're thinking about starting or you're working on that is a project that would happen in a resource-constrained context, I will have us be doing a mapping activity at the end, maybe simultaneously with the questions. So the first axis of the framework is asset utilization, and this refers to the extent to which an intervention recognizes and leverages resources already existing in the community. So these assets include physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, skills and knowledge, networks, and environmental resources. And we were inspired by the international community development literatures, where assets-based community development was articulated as a development strategy that starts with what is present in the community instead of a dominant needs-based approach which focuses on a community's deficiencies, what they lack, and what's missing. And so the way we have it set up in the framework is that it sort of goes up in the way that the more an intervention leverages resources already existing in the population, the more likely the intervention is to have sustainable impact. And so we propose that even in the most resource-constrained communities, the design should begin with what is already there. And this goes beyond talking to users or understanding their context or valuing their knowledge of work processes. It means taking the community assets seriously as a starting point, using them as materials to design with, and really rooting the design in the skills and materials, equipment and facilities and structures that are already embedded in the community. Novelty, which is the other axis, refers to the extent to which an intervention involves invention in technology and practice. And we know that novelty is a big deal in the CHI community, as we saw in our word counts. And we join other CI researchers who have criticized excessive novelty and pointed out the drawbacks and costs of innovation. And so when assessing the novelty of an intervention, we're making a distinction between inventions in hardware and software on the one hand and inventions in practice on the other hand, which we refer to as applying existing technology into new contexts. And so here we have the novelty axis, which indicates that the more novel an intervention is, the less likely the intervention is to actually have sustainable impact. And this is because technological invention incurs high and often overlooked costs, such as the cost of production of a new artifact, learning and training, new maintenance and repair strategies. And while there are still similar costs associated with inventions in practice, these are usually more easily mitigated since someone out there in the world has already developed some of these expertises, and you can lean on that even if the technology is new to your community. So, like I said, we will be doing a mapping activity at the end, but what we hoped for this framework was that it would help researchers who are thinking about doing interventions in resource-constrained contexts to plot and then think about where could you perhaps adjust your intervention design to leverage more assets to really use what is already in the community to design with, and how can you minimize novelty so that it's more likely that the intervention will have legs and will be able to stay in the community and actually do something. And then we also use this framework to categorize a few groups of interventions and discuss a little bit how they tend to fare in delivering sustainable impact. So these groups are the invention of new technology, which is a group of interventions we've plotted here that are low in asset utilization and high in novelty. And we also have the adoption of existing technologies, which are novel to the population, but not to the world at large. And finally, we have the amplification of practices already existing within the community, where interventions facilitate further uptake of technology practices that some members of the community have already adopted. And so I'm going to share a few examples of each of these from my field work, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's difficult to break up with novelty, which we saw is pretty embedded in the CHI community, and the needs-based approach. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about assets-based design, which is essentially a name that we applied to design that maximizes asset utilization and minimizes novelty. So I'm not going to get too much into the invention example because it's basically the story of Project X that I was telling at the beginning. But essentially, it was very successful in terms of user testing, responding to the community's needs, but ultimately the platform could not be deployed because of copyright complications. And I think that this is a story that is not alone in the CHI community. There's lots of papers published about prototypes, but very small amount of follow-up, and part of that is the nature of research, but I think that when we are really sort of trying to make a difference in communities that are in need, and also that are underserved in many ways, it's important to also consider sustainable impact. And so while we did work closely with the Literacy Center, all the interactions with the field site really focused on needs and then on how to customize the invention for usability and engagement. And this focus really missed a lot of assets that could have supported something that could have actually reached the community and supported them in some way. Now, the adoption example I want to share involves the introduction of a free online platform called Quizlet at the Literacy Center. And we were actually able to use Quizlet to help students practice class content outside of class time, which was a major goal of the platform that we had invented but could not use. And so although Quizlet was not designed for low literate students, we were able to teach students to navigate to the sets and tap the sound icon to listen to pronunciation. And so it went from these black and white worksheets, which were all that they had, and since they were low literate, this didn't really allow them to practice outside of class, to being able to listen to pronunciation and slowly gain practice through the app. And so since Quizlet was already existing and free, we did not have to face any hurdles with developing, releasing, or maintaining the platform, but we did incur some costs since Quizlet was new to the Literacy Center. But like I had mentioned before, we had sort of existing websites and forums that were able to help mitigate these costs for us. And finally, I'm going to share a quick example. I was going to do two, but I'm just going to do one because I want to have time for the activity, about the amplification approach. So I'm going to tell a story about a student named Ming. She's not on here. These are just stock photos to illustrate the example. But she was a student from China who worked at a factory making lampshades, and she was very proud of her work, and she had taken a photo on her phone of a particularly impressive lampshade that she had made, and she was showing it to her teacher one day after class. And then in a later class, the teacher was asking each student to share what they did for a job, and Ming didn't know how to say, like, oh, I make lampshades. But she eventually pulled out her phone and showed the picture of the lampshade she had made and passed it around the table. And in this way, she was able to sort of express something that she otherwise would not have been able to express. And the teacher began to amplify this kind of practice by encouraging other students to share more about themselves by using existing photos on their phones. And this was something that was easily sustained because almost everybody had a phone, brought it with them to class, already had photos on it, knew how to take photos, knew how to view photos they'd already taken. And even the few people who maybe struggled with these skills were easily able to get help from their fellow students. And so this was able to accomplish this goal of sharing media. That there was also talk at the Literacy Center about buying projectors to accomplish a similar goal, but this never panned out. And it's not only because projectors are expensive, but because of additional hidden costs, like we don't keep the classrooms locked because students go in and out of them. But now if we have these expensive projectors, we're going to have to protect them, and the teacher's going to have to come in early to set them up, and all of these other costs that, I think the Literacy Center was actually pretty confident it could get grants to, there's all these grants to get new technology if you are a nonprofit, but those additional costs were the ones that really prevented that from being a sustainable solution for the Literacy Center. Whereas something that built on things that people in the community were already doing was able to accomplish a similar end. So before I conclude, I wanted to talk a little bit about why it's really hard to break up with novelty and needs-based approaches, because we are not the first people to sort of point these things out, and yet it's, as we saw, well, now we have a nice visualization of the extent to which, nothing really changes when people call out that, innovation and novelty are not necessarily sacred. First of all, the roots of this community, which is more in engineering and invention, is sort of the wheelhouse of people, and even when researchers begin to engage with resource-constrained communities, they sort of have this basis in very resource-rich communities where novelty is rewarded, and so it's pretty hard to, I think, switch gears like that, and people rely on what they already know how to do, and venues like CHI often incentivize you to invent something that's a new, visible contribution over maybe applying something that's already been done before, or even just showing an effective strategy that already exists in communities and making that further uptaken in that community. And also, a lot of times there is an institutional sort of baked-inness of a needs-based approach where it's organized around distributing fundings to resource-constrained communities based on a specific need that they have, or you apply by being the neediest community. That's how you get resources and funding for your projects. So all of these things make it quite hard for, I think, or help explain why the field has not really changed, even though this is not something that I dreamed of yesterday, no one's ever thought about before. So the final thing I just want to have everyone think about is, again, if you are considering doing interventions in resource-constrained contexts and you care about having sustainable impact, consider using assets-based design, which is just simply maximizing your asset utilization and minimizing novelty. So really looking beyond needs-based orientations, because when you focus on needs, the impulse is to add something, right? The community lacks something, we have to add it. But once you add something in, it's really hard to keep that thing sustained, whereas if you build on what's already there, that not only validates what's already in a community that is oftentimes facing I don't know what the politically correct term is, but that is marginalized, I guess, in some ways. So it's really important to validate what is already there, but it also really helps to make sure your intervention is not just going to disappear when your funding dries up, you move on to a new project or whatever, and you're not wasting that community's time. And additionally, minimizing novelty means not necessarily that you can't be creative, but it's just trying to see how you can reconfigure things that are already in the community, and try to minimize costs associated with invention. It's not trying to minimize creativity or doing anything new, but rather the very costly, resource-rich, splashy, glamorous invention type of work. So now I'm going to end with an invitation for you to come up there and take a Post-it and Sharpie, and yes, it's very on brand for design, and you can write up a little note about a project that maybe you're thinking about working on, you are working on, or yes, thank you, and plot it against the framework. And I would love to have like a little connection, a little collection, and we can post it somewhere. I'll find out where I can post it if anyone's interested in seeing it afterwards. And then also while we do that, we can take questions. Thanks, everyone.
There's lots I have, but one question I have is about assets. Have you been looking both at tangible and intangible assets, so also at non-behavioral assets that communities might have?
Yeah, so I guess an example would be like, do you mean things like, so like skills, like knowing how to use your phone, or like connections? Oh yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I guess that was something that we hadn't explicitly looked at before, but that's a really good one to add. Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Peter from Utilization. I think this is really relevant, and I want to thank you so much for doing this work. So, in the past two papers, we've seen that there's this novelty fetishism at play. Do you have any ideas about how we can get to present work that has a low degree of novelty but a high degree of asset utilization, and actually get to present that kind of work at time, or types of arguments that we might put into these kinds of papers to make it more likely that people will actually think that they count as contributions?
Yeah, that is a really good and important question. So, I mean, I am a very junior member of this community, but I think that part of it is probably has to do with the way papers are reviewed, but there's I think increasingly a push towards not just looking at projects that would be economically viable and would make a great startup or would be splashy. There's arguments about doing social good and ethics, and I think that it's sort of a different kind of contribution that you're making, and I think that increasingly PI can and should be trying to value that.